Okay, I am going to talk about Martha Washington, one of the many American founding mothers of this country. In Martha Washington's early life, she was born June 2nd, 1731, at New Kent County, Virginia. She was the oldest of 8 children. Her father immigrated from England, and her mother was a daughter of the member of Virginia House of Burgess. She wasn't formally educated in her early life. She was just taught how to cook, clean, and tend to children, which did help her later on in the Revolutionary War and as a mother and wife. She then later, unlike most girls, learned how to read and write, which also helped her very much so in life. Religion has always been very important to her, and she was a devout Christian. She grew up Christian and have always been, and still throughout her life, read the Bible and prayed a lot. Marriage and family. Before Martha Washington married George Washington, she had a different husband, and they had 4 children together. 2 of the 4 children did not make it past childhood, but there was still 2, a son and a daughter, who did. Martha's husband ended up dying and leaving her with just the 2 kids. After he died, many people wanted to court her because she was very rich and had a lot of land. George Washington obviously ended up marrying her, and they married on January 6, 1759. The couple, her 2 children, and several enslaved workers moved to the Washington family home in Mount Vernon. The Washingtons themselves never had children, but they raised Martha's children from their first husband together. At the age of 17, her daughter Patsy Curtis died due to seizures, and so she only had 1 son left. Her influence in the Revolutionary War. Her husband was the commander of the American military forces, and Martha spent about half of the war with her husband in camp or nearby. While with him, she copied her husband's letter, knitted for soldiers, and visited in hospitals. She had a group of women raise money, which they used to buy soldiers' shirts and other supplies, which most women did in this time because they could not fight in the war, so they did anything they can to help their husbands and anyone they know in the war to win and succeed. Martha Washington was the First Lady because in 1789, George Washington was called again to serve his country and became the first president. This then, of course, made Martha Washington the very first First Lady. They then had to join Washington in New York, they as in her children and the slaves. Her job then became an asset to the president with his official entertaining. They hosted members of Congress, local politicians, and their wives for dinner on Thursdays, and on Fridays she had a function for both ladies and men to allow the president to mingle with guests. During her husband's years of being president, she was, however, troubled by criticism of her husband in the press and by other political leaders who attacked politically against her husband personally. As far as after the war goes, the Washingtons then became very famous and well known because of all of the things they did for the war. This, however, caused some troubles. They had many guests, some were friends and some were strangers, come into their house in Mount Vernon, and Martha and the Sutherlands had to tend to their needs. In 1785, however, Martha became very sick that year, but she did end up recovering. Throughout the years after the war, many grandchildren were born, and nieces and nephews were going off and getting married and making more grandchildren. A lot of the grandchildren ended up being made responsible by Martha. She had to tend to these grandchildren and help raise them because a lot of the mothers and fathers of these grandchildren died, and so Martha was responsible for them. After his presidency and his death of Martha and George Washington retired from being president in 1797. He then died in 1799, making Martha a widow yet again. However, Martha was too old at this point, and there would be no point of getting remarried. Martha was too heartbroken to attend his funeral, and right after the death, Martha burned all their letters from each other. And then, on May 1802, Martha died surrounded by family. Here are my references and sources. Thank you for listening.